My husband Dane abandoned me at his boss's company dinner after calling me just a wife in front of everyone. What he didn't know was that I was secretly the anonymous benefactor who had been funding his failing architecture firm for 3 years. And I was about to pull every single dollar. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table at Meridian Tower's executive dining room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh. But nothing could illuminate the darkness that was about to engulf my marriage. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my husband Dane gesture wildly with his wine glass as he addressed the table of his colleagues from Lynch & Associates Architecture. Gentlemen, ladies, Dane's voice carried that particular smugness I'd grown to recognize over our 5 years of marriage. Let me tell you about the art of delegation. You see, my wife Dolores here is the perfect example of knowing your role and staying in your lane. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of silverware against fine china. I could feel the eyes of every executive at the table. Hector Lynch, the firm's founder, and Dane's boss, Margaret Hall from the planning department, and Anton Wyatt from project development, all shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed what was about to become the most expensive dinner conversation of my husband's career. She's mastered the art of being just a wife, Dane continued, raising his glass in what he clearly thought was a charming toast. No messy career ambitions, no complicated business opinions, just pure, uncomplicated support from the sidelines where she belongs. I maintained the serene smile I'd perfected over years of attending these corporate functions, the same expression I wore when writing anonymous 7-figure checks to keep Dane's precious architecture firm afloat. If only he knew that the woman he was dismissing as just a wife had been single-handedly preventing his professional extinction for the past 3 years. The irony was almost too perfect. Here we were, surrounded by the city's most influential architects and developers, and Dane was publicly humiliating the very person who had been secretly ensuring his projects received funding, his proposals got approved, and his firm stayed competitive in an increasingly brutal market. Tell them, darling, Dane continued, his words slightly slurred from the expensive Bordeaux that I talked through my anonymous shell company had actually paid for. Tell them about that time you tried to understand one of my project proposals. Remember how confused you got by the technical drawings? I could see Hector Lynch's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. As the founder of Lynch & Associates, he'd been increasingly concerned about the firm's financial stability, completely unaware that the mysterious Bethany Clive Foundation that had been their largest private investor was actually funded by the wife his star architect was currently mocking. I think perhaps we should discuss the Riverside development project, Margaret Hall interjected diplomatically, clearly trying to steer the conversation away from Dane's increasingly inappropriate commentary about his wife. Margaret had always been kind to me at these events, not knowing that I'd been the one quietly ensuring her department received the budget allocations it needed to function. Oh, Margaret, Dane waved his hand dismissively, business talk can wait. I'm giving everyone here a masterclass in work-life balance. You see, the secret to my success is having a wife who understands her limitations. Dolores here has never once tried to interfere with my business decisions, never questioned my strategic choices, never attempted to insert herself into matters beyond her comprehension. The truth was almost laughably different. While Dane slept each night, I worked from my home office, managing a portfolio of investments worth over $50 million, inherited from my late grandmother, and carefully grown through years of strategic financial planning. The Bethany Clive Foundation was just one of several shell companies I used to funnel money into worthy causes, including my husband's perpetually struggling architecture firm. She knows her place, Dane continued, his voice growing louder with each word, and that place is supporting me from behind the scenes, not trying to compete with me in the professional world. Some women, they get these ideas about being equal partners in business matters. But not my Dolores, she's perfectly content being just a wife. I watched Anton Wyatt check his phone under the table, probably reviewing the same financial reports I'd seen earlier that day. Reports showing Lynch and Associates was 3 months away from bankruptcy without their mysterious anonymous investor's continued support. Anton had no idea he was looking at numbers that I could change with a single phone call. The private dining room fell silent except for the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, some pitying, others embarrassed by Dane's public display of condescension. None of them knowing they were witnessing the moment that would mark the beginning of the end for Dane Hall's architectural career. I mean, can you imagine? Dane laughed, completely oblivious to the tension he'd created. Dolores trying to understand commercial real estate financing, investment strategies, market analysis. It would be like asking a child to perform surgery. I took a careful sip of my water, the same measured composure I maintained during million-dollar investment meetings. In my purse, my phone buzzed with another update from my financial advisor about tomorrow's scheduled board meeting, where we would review all current charitable investments, including the ones keeping my husband's firm alive. That's what makes our marriage work, Dane declared, pointing at me with his wine glass. She doesn't try to be something she's not. She accepts that business is a man's world and stays in her proper sphere. The domestic one, just a wife, and proud of it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, though Dane was too intoxicated by his own perceived cleverness to realize he'd just sealed his fate. In less than 24 hours, he would discover exactly what this just a wife was capable of when properly motivated. As I excused myself to use the powder room, leaving Dane to continue his misguided lecture on gender roles to an increasingly uncomfortable audience, I was already mentally composing the phone calls I would make tomorrow morning. The calls that would transform me from just a wife into the woman who destroyed her husband's career with the stroke of a pen. After all, I hadn't spent 3 years secretly funding his dreams just to let him publicly humiliate me without consequences. Some lessons, I reflected as I walked down the marble hallway, are worth $50 million to teach. When I returned from the powder room, Dane had somehow managed to make the situation even worse. He was now standing beside his chair, using his cloth napkin as a makeshift presentation prop, while explaining to the table why women were fundamentally incapable of understanding architectural theory. You see, spatial reasoning is predominantly a male cognitive trait, he declared, completely oblivious to Margaret Hall's increasingly frosty expression. Margaret, who held a master's degree in urban planning from MIT, was watching my husband with the kind of controlled fury I recognized from my own investment meetings when dealing with particularly condescending male clients. Dane, Hector Lynch interrupted gently, his weathered face showing signs of strain. Perhaps we should discuss the Wellington Project timeline instead. The Wellington Project, I nearly smiled at the irony. 3 months ago, when Lynch and Associates was struggling to secure the initial development loan for that very project, a mysterious benefactor through the Bethany Clive Foundation had provided a bridge loan of $12 million. Dane had celebrated for weeks, completely unaware that his wife's signature on a single document had saved his most prestigious commission. "Oh, Hector," Dane waved dismissively, "business can wait. I'm conducting an educational seminar here." He turned back to the table with renewed enthusiasm. "Where was I? Ah yes, cognitive differences. Take my Dolores for example." I slipped back into my seat quietly, noting how Anton Wyatt was discreetly taking notes on his phone. Anton had always struck me as the most observant member of Lynch and Associates' executive team.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And I wondered if he was beginning to piece together the pattern of mysterious funding that had kept their firm competitive over the past 3 years. Dolores has many wonderful qualities, Dane continued, his patronizing tone making my skin crawl. She's excellent at organizing our social calendar, fantastic at remembering anniversary dates, absolutely brilliant at coordinating dinner parties like the one we hosted last month for the Morrison family. The Morrison family dinner. Another delicious irony. I had indeed organized that evening, but not for the reasons Dane assumed. James Morrison was one of the city's most influential real estate developers, and I had strategically arranged that gathering to introduce him to several key investors who later became instrumental in funding the Harbor District renovation project. Another commission that had mysteriously landed in Dane's lap thanks to connections he didn't know his wife possessed. But ask her to explain load-bearing calculations or zoning variance applications. Dane laughed heartily. You might as well ask her to perform brain surgery. It's simply not how the female mind works. I watched Margaret Hall's knuckles whiten around her wineglass. Margaret had personally designed the structural modifications for 3 of the city's most iconic buildings, but Dane had always dismissed her contributions as decorative consulting whenever the topic arose in casual conversation. My wife represents the ideal division of labor in a marriage, Dane proclaimed, now fully committed to his impromptu lecture. I handle the complex business decisions, the strategic planning, the financial management, while she focuses on what women do best, creating a supportive home environment. Financial management. If Dane only knew that while he struggled to balance his corporate expense account, I managed a diversified investment portfolio that included commercial real estate holdings, technology startup investments, and a hedge fund that had consistently outperformed the market for 7 consecutive years. The supportive home environment he praised me for creating was actually carefully orchestrated networking events, disguised as social gatherings. Take last week for instance, Dane continued, warming to his theme. Dolores spent the entire afternoon researching charity organizations for our annual donations. Sweet gesture, really, but completely unnecessary. I simply wrote a check to the United Way and called it done. Women, they get so emotionally involved in these decisions. I maintained my serene expression while internally calculating the irony. Last week's afternoon of charity research had actually been a strategic meeting with my financial advisors to restructure the Bethany Clive Foundation's giving priorities. The decision to continue funding Lynch and Associates through Q4 had been hanging in the balance, pending my assessment of whether the firm's leadership demonstrated sufficient vision and character to warrant ongoing support. The point is, Dane raised his glass again, successful men need wives who understand their limitations. Dolores here has never once questioned my business judgment, never tried to offer unsolicited advice about client relationships, never attempted to insert herself into negotiations or contract discussions. Anton Wyatt looked up from his phone, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Hall, your wife strikes me as quite intelligent. Surely she has opinions about your work. Oh, Anton, Dane chuckled condescendingly. Of course she's intelligent within her sphere. She can discuss literature, art, social events, typical feminine interests. But business intelligence, strategic thinking, market analysis, those require a different kind of mind entirely. I thought about the quarterly review meeting I had scheduled for tomorrow morning with my investment team. We would be analyzing the performance of 17 different portfolio companies, including a comprehensive assessment of Lynch and Associates' financial health and future viability. The decision about whether to continue the Bethany Clive Foundation's support would depend largely on my evaluation of the firm's leadership quality and long-term potential. I'll give you a perfect example, Dane continued, clearly enjoying what he perceived as a captive audience. Last month, Dolores asked me about the Riverside development financing. Adorable, really. She'd overheard me on a phone call and wanted to understand what a construction loan was. The Riverside development. Another masterpiece of irony. I hadn't been asking about construction loans out of curiosity. I had been the primary private investor in that project, contributing $8 million through a subsidiary of my investment company. My innocent questions had been my way of gauging whether Dane understood the complexities of the deal he was working on, or if he was simply riding the wave of mysterious funding without comprehending its source. I spent 20 minutes explaining basic financing concepts to her. Dane said with fond condescension, and she just nodded along with this sweet, confused expression. It was like trying to teach calculus to a golden retriever, earnest effort but ultimately hopeless. The table had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense the tension as they moved silently around the room, refilling wine glasses and removing empty plates. I could see Hector Lynch checking his watch, probably calculating how much longer he would have to endure his star architect's public humiliation of his wife. That's what I love about Dolores, Dane concluded, sitting back down with satisfaction. She knows her place, stays in her lane, and never tries to pretend she understands things beyond her natural capabilities. Just a wife, and she's perfected the role beautifully. The uncomfortable silence that followed Dane's declaration was broken by the arrival of the main course. Herb-crusted salmon with truffle risotto that I knew cost more per plate than most people earned in a day. The irony wasn't lost on me that the Bethany Clive Foundation had sponsored this very dining room's renovation 2 years ago, complete with the custom Italian marble table where my husband was now systematically destroying his career. You know what the problem is with modern marriages? Dane asked, cutting into his salmon with the precision he usually reserved for architectural blueprints. Too many women have been convinced they should be equal partners in business decisions. It's destroying the natural order of things. Margaret Hall set down her fork with deliberate control. As Lynch and Associates head of planning, she had personally overseen projects worth over $200 million, but Dane had always treated her contributions as supplementary to the real work done by the male architects. Dane, Hector Lynch tried again, his voice carrying a note of warning that my husband was too intoxicated by his own rhetoric to recognize. Perhaps we should focus on the evening's business matters. This is business, Hector, Dane replied with growing confidence. I'm sharing the secrets of my success with our team, and the biggest secret is having a wife who doesn't try to be something she's not. I carefully cut another piece of salmon, remembering the board meeting 3 months ago where I had personally convinced 5 major investors to back Lynch and Associates' expansion into sustainable architecture. The meeting had taken place while Dane was at his weekly golf game, completely unaware that his wife was orchestrating the financial support that would later be presented to him as a lucky break in the market. Take financial planning, for instance, Dane continued, gesturing with his wine glass. Dolores here balances our household checkbook, and barely manages that. The other day she asked me what a municipal bond was. Can you imagine, a municipal bond? The truth was considerably different. Last Tuesday, while Dane attended his Architecture Society meeting, I had been on a conference call with municipal bond specialists, structuring a $40 million investment in infrastructure projects across 3 states. My innocent question about municipal bonds had been my way of testing whether my husband understood the broader economic forces affecting his industry. She means well, Dane said, with the patronizing affection one might show a beloved pet, but asking Dolores about investment strategies would be like asking her to design a skyscraper. Sweet intention, complete lack of capability. Anton Wyatt leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Hall, do you ever wish you understood more about your husband's work? Before I could respond, Dane laughed loudly. Oh, Anton, she's tried, haven't you, darling? Remember when you attempted to read one of my project proposals? She got confused by the executive summary and gave up before reaching the technical specifications. I remembered that evening perfectly. The project proposal in question had been for the Harbor District renovation, and I hadn't been confused by the executive summary. I had been analyzing its financial projections for accuracy. The numbers had been so wildly optimistic that I'd spent the following week working with my investment team to create a realistic funding structure that could actually support Dane's ambitious vision. The thing about women like my wife, Dane continued, warming to his theme, is that they're self-aware enough to know their limitations. Dolores has never once tried to offer business advice, never questioned my strategic decisions, never attempted to network with my professional contacts. I thought about the quarterly networking events I hosted at our home, gatherings that Dane believed were simple dinner parties but were actually carefully orchestrated meetings where I connected architects, developers, and investors. Half the business relationships that kept Lynch and Associates competitive had been formed over my dining room table, with Dane assuming the connections had materialized through his own professional charm. Last month, Dane said, pointing his fork at me with theatrical emphasis, Dolores asked me what due diligence meant. Due diligence meant due diligence, as if she might someday need to evaluate investment opportunities or assess business partnerships. The due diligence question had been strategic, not naive. I had been considering whether to increase the Bethany Clive Foundation's investment in Lynch and Associates, and I wanted to gauge Dane's understanding of the evaluation process that his firm's mysterious benefactor might be conducting. His dismissive explanation had actually helped me realize how little he understood about the source of his recent success. She's happiest when she's planning social events or organizing charity fundraisers, Dane declared. That's where her talents truly shine, the domestic sphere, the social coordination, the emotional labor that keeps a successful man's life running smoothly. Those charity fundraisers had generated over $12 million in the past 2 years, money that I had strategically redirected toward architectural preservation projects and sustainable development initiatives. The social coordination, Dane praised me for, included managing relationships with some of the city's most influential power brokers, connections that had directly benefited his career in ways he was too self-absorbed to recognize. I'll tell you what impressed me most about Dolores when we first met, Dane continued, his voice taking on the sentimental tone he adopted when feeling particularly pleased with himself. She never once tried to compete with me intellectually. Never attempted to demonstrate business knowledge she clearly didn't possess. She was comfortable being just a wife from day one. The memory stung because it contained a grain of truth twisted beyond recognition. When we'd first met at a gallery opening 5 years ago, I had been deliberately understated about my professional life, a habit formed after years of watching men's interest evaporate the moment they learned about my wealth and business acumen. I had let Dane assume what he wanted to assume, finding his company pleasant enough to explore a relationship where I could step back from being Margaret Eleanor Wyatt, heir to the Wyatt industrial fortune, and simply be Dolores, a woman who enjoyed art and conversation. She understood instinctively that successful relationships require complementary roles, not competing ones, Dane proclaimed. While I focus on building our financial future through my architectural practice, she creates the stable home environment that makes my success possible. I nearly smiled at the complete inversion of reality. While Dane struggled to land consistently profitable projects, I had been quietly building wealth through strategic investments and carefully managed trusts. The stable home environment he credited me with creating was actually a sophisticated operation where I conducted business meetings disguised as social gatherings, managed a complex web of anonymous charitable foundations, and maintained professional relationships with some of the country's most successful investors and developers. That's true partnership, Dane concluded, raising his glass in another self-congratulatory toast. Each person playing to their natural strengths, accepting their inherent limitations and supporting the other's success. Dolores knows she's just a wife, and she's made it into an art form. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something shift inside me, the same cold clarity that had guided me through hostile takeover negotiations and complex merger discussions. Dane had just provided me with the perfect justification for what I was about to do. After all, if I was going to be dismissed as just a wife, I might as well show him exactly what this particular wife was capable of when properly motivated. The tension in the room had become almost palpable when I finally decided to test the waters. Setting down my wine glass with deliberate precision, I looked directly at my husband and spoke for the first time since returning from the powder room. "Actually, Dane, I've been wondering about something," I said, my voice carrying the same quiet authority I used during investment committee meetings. "The Wellington project's financing structure seems unusually complex. How did Lynch and Associates manage to secure such favorable terms from the primary lender?" The question was carefully calculated. I knew exactly how those favorable terms had been secured, through a series of guarantees and collateral arrangements facilitated by the Bethany Clive Foundation, but I was curious to see if Dane understood the mechanics of his own supposed success. Dane's laugh cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, with exaggerated patience, "that's exactly what I mean about women trying to understand business matters beyond their comprehension. The Wellington financing involved sophisticated debt structures, mezzanine capital arrangements, and risk mitigation strategies that take years of experience to master. But surely the basic concept isn't that complicated." I pressed gently, adopting the tone of innocent curiosity that had served me well in countless boardroom negotiations. "From what I understand, someone provided additional security to make the bank comfortable with the loan terms. Who was that mysterious benefactor?" I watched Anton Wyatt's eyebrows rise slightly at my question. As Lynch and Associates development director, he had been intimately involved in the Wellington financing, and knew better than most how unusual their benefactor's involvement had been. The look he gave me was suddenly more appraising, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. "Mysterious benefactor," Dane scoffed. "Dolores, you've been reading too many romance novels. Business doesn't work that way. The Wellington project succeeded because of my reputation in the industry, my relationships with key players, and my ability to present compelling investment opportunities." "Of course," I replied smoothly, "but didn't the Bethany Clive Foundation provide some form of guarantee or collateral enhancement? I seem to remember overhearing you on a phone call about foundation involvement." Margaret Hall nearly choked on her wine. As someone who regularly worked with charitable foundations in her urban planning role, she would recognize the Bethany Clive Foundation as one of the most influential private charitable organizations in the region, an entity that didn't typically involve itself in commercial real estate deals unless there were compelling strategic reasons. "Foundation involvement," Dane repeated dismissively, waving his hand as if brushing away an annoying insect. "Sweetheart, you're confusing bits and pieces of conversations you didn't understand. The Bethany Clive Foundation is a charitable organization. They donate money to worthy causes. They don't provide commercial financing guarantees." The irony was breathtaking. Here was my husband explaining to me how my own foundation operated, getting nearly every detail wrong while pontificating about business matters beyond my supposed comprehension. "I see," I said thoughtfully. "So when you mentioned that the foundation had provided unprecedented support for the project, you were referring to some kind of charitable component." Dane's face flushed slightly. I could see him struggling to reconcile his dismissive attitude toward my intelligence with the uncomfortably accurate details I was citing. "You know what, Dolores, this is exactly the problem I was talking about. You overhear fragments of complex business discussions and try to piece them together into something that makes sense to you, but you're missing the crucial context that would help you understand what's really happening. Then perhaps you could provide that context, I suggested, maintaining my innocent expression while watching Hector Lynch's increasingly uncomfortable body language. As the firm's founder, Hector had been personally involved in the negotiations with the mysterious foundation representative, though he had no idea he'd been corresponding with shell companies controlled by his employee's wife. The context, darling, Dane said with patronizing slowness, is that commercial real estate financing involves multiple layers of complexity that require years of professional experience to understand. When I mention foundation involvement, I'm referring to regulatory compliance issues, tax incentive structures, and community development requirements that intersect with charitable organization mandates in ways that are frankly too sophisticated for casual dinner conversation. I nodded thoughtfully, as if processing this explanation. In reality, I was marveling at Dane's ability to string together impressive-sounding business jargon while saying absolutely nothing substantive. The truth was that he had no idea how the Bethany Clive Foundation's involvement had actually worked because he had never bothered to understand the details. He had simply accepted the mysterious good fortune and claimed credit for engineering it.
That makes sense, I said finally. I suppose I was overthinking what seemed like unusual coincidences. The way Lynch and Associates has secured such advantageous terms on multiple projects over the past few years, almost as if someone with significant resources was actively working to ensure the firm's success. Anton Wyatt set down his fork entirely, now giving me his complete attention. The pattern I was describing was one he had noticed himself, the uncanny way their firm had repeatedly benefited from last-minute funding solutions, favorable regulatory decisions, and unexpected investor interest in their projects. Advantageous terms. Dane laughed, but I detected a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Dolores, we've been successful because Lynch and Associates consistently delivers exceptional work. Success breeds success. It's not mysterious, it's just good business. Of course, I agreed readily. Though I do find it interesting how the timing has worked out. The Harbor District renovation funding came through just when your firm needed a major project to establish credibility in sustainable architecture. The Riverside development investor materialized exactly when you were struggling with that cash flow problem last year. And now the Wellington project, with its unusual financing structure, arriving just as Lynch and Associates was looking to expand into luxury residential development. The silence that followed my observation was profound. I could see the wheels turning in Anton's mind, as he recognized the pattern I was describing, a pattern that suggested either extraordinary luck or deliberate orchestration. Margaret Hall was studying me with new interest, her expression suggesting she was rapidly reassessing everything she thought she knew about Dane Hall's quiet wife. You know what this is? Dane said suddenly, his voice taking on a defensive edge. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Women hear bits and pieces of business information and convince themselves they've discovered some kind of conspiracy or hidden pattern. It's like when people see faces in clouds, the human mind's tendency to impose meaning on random events. But I could see doubt flickering in his eyes. For the first time all evening, my husband was questioning whether his string of professional successes might be more than just the natural result of his own talents and efforts. You're probably right, I said with a gentle smile. I'm sure it's just coincidence that everything has worked out so perfectly for Lynch and Associates lately. The word coincidence hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched as the seed of uncertainty I had planted began to take root in my husband's mind. Dane's growing unease with my questions seemed to trigger something defensive and ugly in him. Instead of retreating from his earlier condescension,
He doubled down with a viciousness that surprised even me. "You know what, everyone?" Dane announced suddenly, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the neighboring tables in the restaurant. "I think we're witnessing a perfect example of why successful men need wives who understand their limitations." He stood up abruptly, swaying slightly from the wine, and I realized with growing horror that he was about to make this evening even worse than I had imagined. "My dear wife Dolores has just spent the last 10 minutes trying to convince this table that she's uncovered some kind of business conspiracy," Dane declared, gesturing toward me with theatrical flair. "She's convinced herself that our firm's recent successes are the result of mysterious benefactors and hidden patterns rather than, actual professional competence." I felt heat rise to my cheeks as every eye in the private dining room focused on me. This was no longer casual dismissal, this was public humiliation designed to put me firmly in what Dane considered my proper place. This is exactly what happens when wives try to participate in business discussions they're fundamentally unequipped to understand. Dane continued, his voice carrying to tables beyond our own. "They hear fragments of complex conversations, misinterpret basic business terminology, and then convince themselves they've discovered something significant." Anton Wyatt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly embarrassed by my husband's behavior. "Dane, perhaps we should." No, this is educational," Dane interrupted, raising his hand dismissively. "Everyone here needs to understand the importance of maintaining proper boundaries in professional relationships. When wives start imagining they understand their husband's business, it creates confusion and undermines the very expertise that makes success possible." I maintained my composure through sheer will, the same iron control that had gotten me through hostile shareholder meetings and contentious board negotiations. Inside, however, I was calculating exactly how much this public humiliation was going to cost my husband's career. "Dolores, sweetheart," Dane said, turning to address me directly with condescending sweetness, "I want you to understand something important. The reason Lynch and Associates has been successful lately isn't because of mysterious foundations or hidden benefactors. It's because I've worked 16-hour days for the past 3 years building relationships, developing expertise, and earning the respect of this industry." The 16-hour days he referenced had largely been spent at the golf course, networking events, and long lunches with potential clients, all of which I had quietly funded through strategic charitable donations and carefully orchestrated business introductions. "When you suggest that our success is somehow artificial or manufactured," Dane continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "you're not just embarrassing yourself, you're insulting every person at this table who has worked hard to build their professional reputation." Hector Lynch looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Margaret Hall was staring at Dane with barely concealed disgust. Anton Wyatt was discreetly typing something on his phone, probably documenting this disaster for future reference. "I mean, let's be realistic here," Dane said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire room. "What could my wife possibly know about commercial real estate financing, about architectural project management, about the complex relationships between developers, investors, and municipal planning departments?" Each question felt like a slap, but I absorbed them silently while mentally reviewing the extensive files I maintained on every one of those topics. Files that contained detailed analyses of market trends, regulatory changes, and investment opportunities that had directly contributed to Lynch and Associates' recent string of successes. "She's a lovely woman," Dane declared, his tone shifting to the kind of patronizing affection typically reserved for small children or beloved pets. "Excellent at organizing social events, wonderful at maintaining our home, absolutely devoted to supporting my career from the sidelines where she belongs. But business acumen, strategic thinking, understanding complex financial structures. He laughed loudly, shaking his head as if the very idea was absurd. Gentlemen, ladies, Dane concluded, raising his wineglass in what he clearly intended as a final toast to his own wisdom, I gave you the perfect example of why successful marriages require clearly defined roles. My wife knows she's just a wife, and she's never tried to pretend otherwise. Until tonight, apparently. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of everyone's embarrassment. Not for me, but for Dane, who had just publicly humiliated his wife in front of his professional colleagues with a cruelty that revealed far more about his character than mine. Well, I said quietly, setting my napkin beside my plate with careful precision, I suppose I should stop asking questions that are clearly beyond my comprehension. My voice was steady, controlled, giving no hint of the storm that was building inside me. Dane smiled triumphantly, apparently believing he had successfully put me back in my proper place. He had no idea that he had just provided me with the perfect justification for destroying everything he held dear. Exactly right, darling, Dane said, settling back into his chair with satisfied smugness. Sometimes the wisest thing a wife can do is simply listen and learn. I smiled back at him, a serene expression that masked the cold calculation now driving every thought in my head. Tomorrow morning, Dane would discover just how much this just a wife had been listening and learning over the past 3 years. The dessert course arrived with impeccable timing, crème brûlée, with gold leaf garnish that sparkled under the chandelier's light. I watched the waitstaff serve each guest with professional precision, noting how they avoided direct eye contact after witnessing Dane's public humiliation of his wife. Even the service staff recognized inappropriate behavior when they saw it. But Dane, emboldened by what he perceived as his successful educational demonstration, was far from finished. You know what the real problem is with modern society, he announced, cracking the caramelized sugar on his dessert with unnecessary force. We've convinced women that they should aspire to roles they're fundamentally unqualified for instead of excelling in the areas where they naturally belong. I took a delicate spoonful of my crème brûlée, tasting the Madagascar vanilla while mentally calculating the cost of what Dane was about to learn. The Bethany Clive Foundation's quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and the primary agenda item was reviewing our ongoing support for various architectural and development projects. Take the women's liberation movement, Dane continued, warming to his theme with the passion of someone who believed he was sharing profound insights. They've taught women like my wife that they should feel inadequate if they're not competing in boardrooms and negotiating business deals. But that's not where women's strengths lie. Margaret Hall's jaw had tightened to the point where I worried she might crack a tooth. As one of the few female executives in the architecture industry, she had undoubtedly faced years of exactly this kind of condescending theorizing about women's natural capabilities. A woman's true power, Dane declared, pointing his dessert spoon at me with theatrical emphasis, lies in her ability to support and nurture, to create the stable foundation that allows men to take the risks necessary for business success. Dolores here understands this instinctively. I thought about the quarterly risk assessment reports I reviewed each month, analyzing potential investments across 17 different market sectors. The stable foundation Dane credited me with creating was actually a carefully managed portfolio of strategic partnerships, anonymous funding arrangements, and calculated market interventions that had been propping up his career for 3 years. She's never once complained about the long hours I work, never questioned the business trips I take, never demanded to be included in professional decisions that are frankly beyond her understanding, Dane continued, his voice growing louder with each wine-fueled revelation. That's what real partnership looks like, each person playing to their natural strengths. The business trips he referenced were indeed frequent, but not for the reasons our dinner companions might assume. While Dane attended architecture conferences and networking events, I used his absence to conduct intensive strategy sessions with my investment team, review acquisition opportunities, and maintain the complex web of anonymous charitable relationships that kept Lynch and Associates competitive in an increasingly brutal market. "I'll give you a perfect example," Dane said, settling back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone preparing to deliver what he considered a particularly clever anecdote. "Last week, Dolores found some financial documents in my home office, quarterly reports from various business entities we work with. She asked me what they meant. Those quarterly reports had been from my own shell companies, documents I had deliberately left where Dane might find them to test whether he would recognize the connection between his firm's mysterious good fortune and the organizations funding it. His complete failure to make that connection had been both disappointing and enlightening. I spent an entire evening explaining basic business concepts to her," Dane continued with fond condescension. "Cash flow statements, profit margins, investment returns, the fundamental building blocks of commercial success. And you know what?" She listened with this sweet, grateful expression, like a student finally understanding difficult mathematics. The memory stung because of how completely Dane had misinterpreted the situation. I hadn't been learning those concepts, I had been testing his understanding of them. His explanations had been so oversimplified and frequently inaccurate that I'd had to bite my tongue to avoid correcting him. "That's what I love most about my wife," Dane declared, raising his wineglass in another self-congratulatory toast. "She doesn't pretend to understand things beyond her natural capabilities. She doesn't try to compete with me in areas where she's clearly outmatched. She accepts her role as just a wife and finds fulfillment in perfecting that role." Anton Wyatt was now openly staring at me, his expression suggesting he was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew about our marriage dynamic. The financial reports Dane had mentioned were familiar to Anton. He had been copied on correspondence from several of the business entities in question, though he had never made the connection to his colleague's wife. "In fact," Dane continued, completely oblivious to the growing tension around the table, "I think Dolores represents the ideal that more women should aspire to. She's comfortable with her limitations, supportive of her husband's ambitions, and content to contribute to our success from behind the scenes where she belongs." The phrase "behind the scenes" was more accurate than Dane realized, but not in the way he intended. Everything he attributed to his own business acumen had been orchestrated from behind the scenes by the woman he was now publicly dismissing as intellectually inferior. "She understands that marriage is about complementary strengths, not competing egos," Dane concluded with finality. "I provide the business expertise and financial leadership, while she provides the emotional support and domestic stability that makes my success possible." I set down my dessert spoon and smiled serenely at my husband, the same expression I had worn during countless hostile takeover negotiations. "You're absolutely right, darling. I should definitely stay in my lane and leave the complex business decisions to you." Dane beamed at what he interpreted as my acknowledgement of his superior wisdom, completely missing the dangerous undertone in my agreement. "Exactly," he said triumphantly. "Just a wife, and proud of it." The words sealed his fate, though he was too intoxicated by his own perceived cleverness to realize it. By tomorrow evening, Dane would understand exactly what this particular just a wife was capable of when properly motivated. 2 hours later, I sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Wyatt Financial Tower, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city's glittering skyline. The emergency meeting I had called was highly unusual. The Bethany Clive Foundation's board typically convened only during regular quarterly sessions, but the circumstances were extraordinary. "Thank you all for accommodating this last-minute gathering," I said, addressing the 5 individuals who comprised the Foundation's executive committee. These weren't the society volunteers that Dane imagined when he dismissed my charity work. They were some of the city's most sophisticated financial minds, handpicked for their expertise in strategic philanthropy and investment management. Given tonight's developments, I continued, opening the leather portfolio that contained detailed files on every investment decision I had made over the past 3 years. I believe it's time to conduct a comprehensive review of our architectural and development sector commitments. My assistant Harper Lynch, no relation to Hector, despite the shared surname, distributed copies of the executive summary I had prepared during the drive from the restaurant. Harper was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my dual identity, having helped me maintain the careful separation between Dolores Hall, devoted wife, and D.E. Wyatt, the mysterious benefactor whose decisions shaped the city's development landscape. As you can see from the documentation, I explained, noting how each board member studied the numbers with the focused attention of experienced professionals. Lynch & Associates Architecture has received approximately $14 million in direct and indirect support through our various shell companies over the past 36 months. The figures were staggering when presented in aggregate. What had seemed like a series of separate charitable decisions suddenly revealed itself as a systematic campaign to support one particular architectural firm, a campaign that had been driven more by personal loyalty than strategic philanthropic objectives. The Harbor District renovation project, I continued, clicking to the next slide of my presentation, received $8 million in bridge financing through our urban development initiative. The Riverside Complex secured $12 million through our Sustainable Architecture Fund. The Wellington project benefited from loan guarantees worth $6 million through our Community Development Program. Bethany Clive, the Foundation's nominal chairwoman and my closest confidant since our Harvard Business School days, leaned forward with concern. Dolores, these numbers suggest a significant concentration of risk in a single firm. What's your assessment of Lynch & Associates' actual performance independent of our support? The question I had been dreading. Without our intervention, I admitted, the firm would have declared bankruptcy 18 months ago. Their organic growth has been minimal, their client acquisition outside of our network has been inconsistent, and their financial management has been problematic. Margaret Wyatt, my cousin and the Foundation's investment director, raised an eyebrow. Are you telling us that we've essentially been subsidizing a failing business out of personal attachment? That's precisely what I'm telling you, I replied, the words tasting bitter despite their accuracy. And tonight's dinner has convinced me that this attachment has been fundamentally misplaced. I proceeded to describe the evening's events in clinical detail, focusing on the professional implications rather than the personal humiliation. These were business minds who understood the strategic importance of information flow, the value of informed decision-making, and the dangers of partnering with individuals who failed to recognize their own dependencies. Let me understand this correctly, said Anton Hall, again, no relation to my husband despite the shared surname, who served as our legal counsel and compliance officer. The primary beneficiary of our largest architectural investments has no awareness of our involvement, and has publicly demonstrated contempt for the kind of analytical thinking that makes our success possible. Furthermore, added Harper, consulting her notes, he's shown himself to be someone who humiliates strategic partners in public settings, demonstrates poor judgment under pressure, and appears to lack the fundamental respect for others that we require in our business relationships. The boardroom fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. The Bethany Clive Foundation had built its reputation on identifying promising individuals and organizations, providing strategic support to amplify their positive impact on the community. Our success rate was extraordinary precisely because we conducted thorough due diligence on character as well as capability. There's another consideration, I added, pulling up the final section of my presentation. Our support for Lynch and Associates has been predicated on the assumption that they represent the kind of forward-thinking, socially conscious architectural practice that aligns with our mission. Tonight's dinner revealed that at least one key principle of the firm holds views about women's capabilities that are fundamentally incompatible with our organizational values. Bethany nodded slowly, her expression grim. The foundation has always maintained that character matters as much as competence in our investment decisions. If we're supporting individuals who publicly diminish women's contributions to business and society, we're undermining our own core principles.
"What are you proposing?" asked Margaret, though I suspected she already knew the answer. I closed my portfolio and looked around the table at these brilliant women and men who had trusted my judgment for years, who had helped me build something meaningful while maintaining the fiction that I was merely a supportive spouse, managing minor charitable activities. I'm proposing that we conduct an immediate and comprehensive withdrawal of all support for Lynch and Associates architecture, effective as of tomorrow morning's market opening, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was suggesting. Every loan guarantee, every bridge financing arrangement, every strategic partnership that has kept them competitive should be terminated simultaneously. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone understood that what I was describing wasn't just a business decision, it was the systematic destruction of my husband's career, orchestrated by the woman he had dismissed as incapable of understanding basic financial concepts. "Are you certain about this course of action?" Bethany asked quietly. "Once we begin withdrawal procedures, there won't be an opportunity to reverse course. Lynch and Associates will face immediate liquidity problems, their ongoing projects will lose financing, and their reputation in the industry will be severely damaged." I stood up, moving to the wall of windows that overlooked the city where my husband was probably still celebrating what he considered a successful evening of putting his wife in her proper place. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied, watching the lights twinkle below like stars in an inverted sky. "It's time Mr. Hall learned what his just a wife is actually capable of." The next phase of the meeting revealed the true scope of what I had built while masquerading as a simple housewife. Harper began distributing additional documentation that outlined the intricate web of relationships and dependencies that connected Lynch and Associates to dozens of other businesses and institutions throughout the city. "As you can see from these organizational charts," Harper explained, her voice carrying the precise authority of someone who had helped orchestrate some of the most complex financial maneuvers in the region, our support for Lynch and Associates extends far beyond direct funding. We've facilitated introductions, provided indirect guarantees, and created networking opportunities that have shaped the firm's entire business ecosystem. I watched the board members study the diagrams with growing amazement. Even I was struck by the visual representation of what had been, until tonight, a series of separate decisions made over months and years. The pattern was undeniable. Lynch and Associates existed at the center of a carefully constructed support network that touched virtually every aspect of the city's architectural and development community. The Morrison family connections, I continued, pointing to a cluster of relationships on the chart, were established through dinner parties at my home that Dane believed were simple social gatherings. James Morrison alone has directed over $20 million in development contracts to Lynch and Associates over the past 2 years. Bethany leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in what appeared to be reluctant admiration. "Dolores, you've essentially created an artificial market ecosystem designed to ensure one firm's success. This is remarkable. It's also completely reversible," added Margaret, her financial analyst's mind already calculating the implications. "Every relationship that was established through the Foundation's network can be redirected toward more deserving recipients. Every business connection that was facilitated through your social events can be refocused.
Anton Hall, our legal counsel, was studying a different section of the documentation. The regulatory approvals that Lynch and Associates has received over the past 3 years, the expedited environmental reviews, the favorable zoning variances, the streamlined permitting processes, how many of those were influenced by foundation relationships? Approximately 70%, Harper replied, without hesitation. Mrs. Hall has maintained strategic friendships with city planning officials, environmental review board members, and municipal development coordinators. Many of these relationships were cultivated through her charitable work, which these officials viewed as evidence of civic-mindedness and community commitment. I thought about the countless hours I had spent at fundraising galas, charity auctions, and community service events, occasions that Dane had attended with good-natured tolerance, never recognizing that his wife was systematically building the political and social capital that would later smooth his firm's path through the complex regulatory landscape of urban development. There's something else, I said, opening another section of my portfolio. The industry recognition that Lynch and Associates has received, the design awards, the professional accolades, the media coverage that has enhanced their reputation, much of that was also strategically orchestrated. I had cultivated relationships with architecture critics, industry journalists, and awards committee members through my involvement in various cultural organizations. When Lynch and Associates projects were featured in prestigious publications or selected for competitive honors, Dane had attributed this success to the inherent quality of his work, never suspecting that his wife had been quietly advocating for his recognition behind the scenes. So what we're discussing, Bethany said slowly, isn't just the withdrawal of financial support. We're talking about the systematic dismantling of a professionally curated support network that has taken years to construct. Exactly, I confirmed. And unlike financial investments, professional relationships can't be rebuilt quickly. Once the architectural community recognizes that Lynch and Associates' success was artificially supported, their reputation will suffer damage that could take decades to repair. Margaret was already taking notes, her mind clearly working through the tactical aspects of what we were contemplating. We'll need to coordinate the timing carefully. If we withdraw support gradually, it might give them time to adapt and find alternative resources. But if we act too quickly, it could appear vindictive rather than strategic. I've given this considerable thought, I replied. The optimal approach is a coordinated announcement tomorrow morning, positioned as a strategic reallocation of foundation resources, rather than a punitive action against any specific organization. Harper nodded approvingly. We can frame it as part of our ongoing commitment to supporting emerging firms and innovative approaches to sustainable architecture. Lynch and Associates, having achieved a certain level of success, no longer requires the intensive support we provide to developing practices. That's perfect, said Anton. It maintains the foundation's reputation for strategic philanthropy while providing clear justification for our decision. No one can accuse us of acting emotionally or vindictively. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in this boardroom, surrounded by some of the city's most sophisticated business minds, planning the methodical destruction of my husband's career while he was probably at home, congratulating himself on having successfully educated his colleagues about the proper role of wives in business relationships. Are we all in agreement about the timeline? I asked, looking around the table at faces that reflected both professional resolve and personal concern for what this decision meant for my marriage. 24 hours, Bethany confirmed. By tomorrow evening, Lynch and Associates will discover what it means to operate without the support network they never knew they had. I closed my portfolio and stood up, feeling the weight of what we had just decided. In less than a day, Dane would learn that his just-a-wife had been the architect of his success, and was now the engineer of his downfall. The city lights sparkled below us like a constellation of possibilities, each one representing opportunities that would soon be redirected away from the man who had publicly humiliated me for daring to ask intelligent questions about his business. By midnight, I was back in my home office, a space that Dane had always dismissed as my hobby room, where I managed my little charity projects. The reality was far more sophisticated. Hidden behind false panels were 3 additional monitors, a secure communication system, and files containing detailed intelligence on every major development project in the metropolitan area. Harper had returned with me to coordinate the final logistics of what we were privately calling Operation Revelation. She sat across from my mahogany desk, her laptop connected to the Foundation's secure servers, methodically working through the checklist we had developed for systematic withdrawal of support. "The Morrison family contracts," Harper reported, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I've prepared termination notices for 5 current projects and cancellation orders for 3 pending developments. Total value $23 million. I nodded, making notes in my leather-bound planner. "What's their timeline for finding alternative partners?" "Realistically, 6 to 8 weeks minimum. But given that Lynch and Associates was selected for these projects based on Foundation recommendations rather than competitive bidding, the Morrisons may choose to start fresh with entirely new architectural firms." The cascade effects were becoming clear. Each relationship I had cultivated, each introduction I had facilitated, each subtle recommendation I had made over the past 3 years had created dependencies that extended far beyond simple financial support. Lynch and Associates wasn't just losing a benefactor, they were losing access to an entire ecosystem of opportunities. "The regulatory relationships?" I asked, moving to the next item on our agenda. Harper consulted her second screen. "I've scheduled breakfast meetings with 7 key municipal officials tomorrow morning. They'll be informed that the Foundation is shifting its focus toward emerging architectural practices, and will no longer be advocating for specific established firms." The breakfast meetings were crucial. City planning officials, environmental review coordinators, and zoning board members had come to view Lynch and Associates favorably, partly because of their association with the respected Bethany Clive Foundation. Without that implicit endorsement, Dane's firm would face the same bureaucratic obstacles and delays that challenged every other architectural practice in the city. The media connections, Architecture Weekly, Urban Development Today, and Metropolitan Design Review. Harper replied, "I've prepared talking points about the Foundation's new initiative to spotlight innovative young architects. The editors will naturally want to feature firms that align with our current priorities." I smiled grimly. Dane had always been puzzled by the favorable press coverage his firm received, never questioning why architecture journalists seemed so interested in his projects, or so willing to feature his work in prominent publications. He had assumed it was the natural result of his design excellence, never suspecting that his wife had been systematically cultivating relationships with editors and critics who valued the Foundation's judgment on emerging trends. "What about the university connections?" I asked, thinking about the guest lecturing opportunities and student recruitment advantages that had enhanced Lynch and Associates' reputation in academic circles. "The architecture schools at State University and Metropolitan College," Harper confirmed. "Both department heads are Foundation Advisory Board members. I've suggested they might want to diversify their industry partnerships to include more women-owned and minority-led firms." The academic relationships had been particularly valuable because they provided Lynch and Associates with access to the most talented graduating students and positioned Dane as a thought leader in sustainable design principles. Without those connections, his firm would lose its pipeline of fresh talent and its credibility as an innovator in contemporary architectural practice. By 2 a.m., we had systematically mapped out the withdrawal of support across 17 different categories of assistance. The scope was staggering. I had apparently been running a shadow operation that touched every aspect of Lynch and Associates' business development, from client acquisition to regulatory approval to media relations. There's one more element we need to address, Harper said, pulling up a final document on her screen. The Wellington Project. The Wellington Project, Dane's crown jewel, the luxury residential development that was supposed to establish Lynch and Associates as a major player in high-end urban architecture. The project that existed only because of loan guarantees and investor introductions that I had quietly arranged through the foundation's network. The primary investors are scheduled to conduct their quarterly review next week, Harper continued. Without foundation backing, the loan terms become immediately unfavorable. The construction timeline will be delayed, the budget will increase, and the profit margins will essentially disappear. I thought about Dane's excitement over the Wellington project, his conviction that it represented the breakthrough that would elevate his career to the next level. He had no idea that every positive development, from the initial client meeting to the favorable financing terms, to the expedited municipal approvals, had been orchestrated by the woman he had publicly dismissed as incapable of understanding business complexities. Implement the full withdrawal, I said finally, closing my planner with decisive finality. Every relationship, every connection, every subtle advantage that I've provided over the past 3 years. By tomorrow evening, Lynch and Associates will be operating exactly as they would have without my intervention. Harper nodded, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. Dolores, you realize there's no going back from this. Once we begin implementation, Dane will discover not just that his success was artificially supported, but that it was supported by his wife, the woman he humiliated in front of his colleagues. I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked our neighborhood. 2 blocks away, I could see the lights still on in Dane's home office, where he was probably reviewing tomorrow's schedule, blissfully unaware that his entire professional world was about to collapse. Harper, I said quietly. My husband spent this evening teaching a room full of successful professionals that wives should know their place and stay in their lane. Tomorrow, he's going to learn exactly what this particular wife's place actually is. The reflection in the window showed a woman who looked calm and composed, but I could see the cold determination in my own eyes. By sunset tomorrow, Dane would understand that his just-a-wife had been the architect of everything he thought he had built through his own efforts. And then he would watch it all disappear, exactly as systematically as it had been created. I woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of Dane humming in the shower, his voice carrying through our ensuite bathroom with the carefree melody of a man who believed he had successfully demonstrated his intellectual superiority the night before. The irony was almost musical. Here was my husband, preparing for what he assumed would be another routine day of architectural triumph, completely oblivious to the systematic dismantling of his career that was already underway. "Good morning, darling," Dane said cheerfully as he emerged from the bathroom, toweling his hair with the confidence of someone who had slept soundly after what he considered a successful evening. "I hope you're not still upset about last night's dinner conversation. Sometimes tough love is necessary to help people understand their strengths and limitations." I maintained my serene expression while sipping my coffee, the same Jamaican Blue Mountain blend that I purchased through one of my shell companies, another small detail of our lifestyle that Dane attributed to his own success, rather than recognizing its true source. "Of course not," I replied smoothly, watching him select his most expensive tie, a Hermes silk piece that had been a gift from grateful clients who were actually Foundation board members expressing their appreciation for my strategic guidance on their development projects. "I understand you were just trying to be educational." Dane beamed at what he interpreted as my acceptance of his wisdom. "Exactly. That's what I love about you, Dolores. You're secure enough in your role to accept guidance when it's offered constructively." The guidance he referenced would soon be flowing in the opposite direction. though Dane was too self-absorbed to recognize the signs. As he knotted his tie with practiced precision, I reviewed the mental checklist of everything that would unfold over the next 12 hours. Harper would be implementing the foundation withdrawals at 8 a.m. The regulatory officials would receive their breakfast briefings by 9 a.m. and the media redirections would be in place by noon. Big day ahead, I commented casually, noting how Dane's reflection in our bedroom mirror showed a man completely at peace with his world. Any important meetings? Actually, yes, Dane replied, straightening his jacket with satisfaction. The Wellington Project investors are conducting their quarterly review next week, so I'm spending today preparing our presentation materials. This project is going to establish Lynch & Associates as the premier luxury residential firm in the region. I nodded supportively while calculating the timing. The Wellington Project investors would receive Harper's carefully worded communication about foundation policy changes at approximately 10 a.m., just as Dane was beginning his preparation for a presentation that would be rendered meaningless by lunchtime. That sounds wonderful, I said, maintaining the supportive wife persona that had served me so well for 3 years. I'm sure your natural business acumen will make the presentation compelling. The phrase natural business acumen felt bitter on my tongue, but Dane accepted the compliment as his due, never questioning how someone with supposedly limited understanding of business concepts could assess his professional capabilities. I'll probably be working late tonight, Dane continued, checking his appearance one final time. The presentation needs to demonstrate why Lynch & Associates has been so successful lately. Our innovative approach to sustainable design, our ability to attract high-profile clients, our excellent relationships with city planning officials. Each element he mentioned had been carefully orchestrated through my foundation work, but Dane had internalized these advantages as evidence of his own professional excellence. Tonight, when those advantages began disappearing, he would face the terrifying realization that his success had been built on foundations he had never recognized or understood. I'll keep dinner warm, I assured him, the same domestic promise I had made countless times over our marriage. Tonight, however, I would be dining with Harper and the foundation board, reviewing the preliminary results of our systematic withdrawal while Dane discovered that his professional world was collapsing around him. After Dane left for his office, whistling the same cheerful tune he had hummed in the shower, I retreated to my home office to monitor the early stages of Operation Revelation. Harper had scheduled regular updates throughout the day, tracking the real-time implementation of each withdrawal phase. At 8:15 a.m., my secure phone buzzed with the first report: Morrison contracts terminated. Official notification sent to Lynch & Associates at 8:10 a.m. At 8:47 a.m., regulatory breakfast meetings completed. New foundation priorities communicated to 7 municipal officials. At 9:23 a.m., Wellington Project investors briefed on foundation policy changes. Quarterly review moved to emergency status. Each update represented another pillar of Dane's artificial success being systematically removed. I imagined him in his corner office, probably still humming as he worked on presentation materials for a project that was already doomed, blissfully unaware that his phone would soon be ringing with increasingly frantic calls from concerned clients and confused partners. The beautiful irony was that Dane's confidence would actually work against him in the coming hours. A more perceptive person might have noticed early warning signs, might have sensed the subtle shifts in tone during business conversations, might have detected the underlying tension in routine communications. But Dane's absolute conviction in his own superiority would blind him to these signals until the collapse became impossible to ignore. By noon I knew he would be wondering why several important calls hadn't been returned. By mid-afternoon, he would be concerned about unusual delays in routine approvals. By evening, he would be panicking as the full scope of his artificial support network became apparent. But for now, Dane Hall was still the successful architect who had put his wife in her proper place the night before, completely unaware that his just-a-wife was orchestrating the most comprehensive business destruction in the city's recent history. The calm before the storm was almost over. At 11:47 a.m., my secure phone rang with Harper's voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement. "Dolores, it's starting. Lynch and Associates just received simultaneous cancellation notices from Morrison Development, Riverside Partners and Metropolitan Construction Group. We're talking about $47 million in contracted work disappearing in a single morning." I set down my coffee cup, watching through my office window as the city continued its normal rhythm, completely unaware that one of its prominent architectural firms was beginning to implode. How is Dane responding? According to our contact in their administrative office, he's been on the phone for the past hour trying to reach James Morrison. He seems to believe there's been some kind of miscommunication or clerical error. The image of Dane frantically dialing numbers, his earlier confidence beginning to crack as reality intruded on his assumptions, was deeply satisfying. He had spent years accepting mysterious good fortune without questioning its source. Now he would experience equally mysterious catastrophe with the same lack of understanding. The Wellington Project investors, I asked, reviewing the timeline we had established. Emergency board meeting called for this afternoon. The loan terms are being restructured as we speak. Without foundation guarantees, the project financing becomes completely unviable. At 12:23 p.m., Harper called again. The Municipal Planning Office has just informed Lynch and Associates that 3 pending projects are being moved to extended review status. The environmental impact assessments that were previously expedited are now subject to standard processing times. I had cultivated relationships with city planning officials over 2 years of foundation work, always presenting myself as a civic-minded citizen concerned with sustainable development practices. These officials had come to trust the foundation's judgment about which architectural firms truly represented innovative approaches to urban planning. Without that implicit endorsement, Dane's projects would face the same bureaucratic obstacles that challenged every other firm in the city. And the media connections. Architecture Weekly called Lynch and Associates this morning to cancel a scheduled feature article about the Wellington project. They're redirecting their coverage toward emerging firms that better represent current trends in sustainable design. By 1:15 p.m., the cascade effects were accelerating beyond even my expectations. Harper's updates were coming every 20 minutes now, each one documenting another pillar of Dane's success crumbling in real time. University partnerships suspended. The guest lecturing opportunities at State University and Metropolitan College have been redistributed to firms with stronger commitments to diversity and inclusion. Professional association endorsements withdrawn. The Metropolitan Architecture Council has decided to feature different firms in their upcoming showcase of regional talent. Industry award nominations reconsidered. 3 design competitions where Lynch and Associates projects were being considered have shifted their focus toward more innovative contemporary work. At 2:30 p.m., I received the call I had been anticipating. Dane's voice on our home phone was strained, lacking the cheerful confidence he had displayed that morning. "Dolores, something very strange is happening at the office. We've had multiple contract cancellations today, and I can't seem to reach any of our usual contacts. Have you noticed anything unusual in your social circles?" Me social circles, even in crisis. Dane couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his wife might have genuine business connections or meaningful professional relationships. To him, my network remained a collection of social acquaintances useful primarily for dinner party planning and charity event coordination. "Nothing unusual," I replied truthfully. The systematic destruction of his career was proceeding exactly as planned, which made it quite usual from my perspective. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," Dane admitted, his voice carrying the first notes of genuine uncertainty I had heard in years. It's probably just a coincidence, maybe the market is shifting, or there's some industry trend I haven't recognized yet. I'm sure it will sort itself out. At 3:45 p.m., Harper's update carried a note of almost gleeful satisfaction. The regulatory approvals for the Harbor District expansion have been indefinitely postponed. City planning officials have decided to conduct additional environmental reviews before proceeding. And the Wellington investors' emergency meeting concluded an hour ago. The project has been suspended pending restructured financing. Without foundation backing, the loan terms increased by 40% and the timeline extended by 18 months. By 4:30 p.m., the scope of the collapse was becoming undeniable. Lynch and Associates had lost over $60 million in contracted work, seen multiple projects suspended or canceled, and found themselves suddenly unable to access the network of relationships that had made their recent success possible.
Hector Lynch has called an emergency partners meeting for 5 p.m., Harper reported. According to our sources inside the firm, they're facing potential bankruptcy within 90 days if they can't replace the lost contracts and restore their project pipeline. I stood at my office window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city where my husband was learning that his professional world had been built on foundations he had never recognized. The man who had publicly dismissed his wife's intelligence was discovering that his own success had been entirely dependent on that same woman's strategic thinking and careful relationship management. The revelation was complete. Now came the reckoning. At exactly 5 p.m., as Hector Lynch was undoubtedly delivering devastating news to his partners, I placed a single phone call to Dane's direct office line. "Hello, darling," I said, when he answered, his voice hollow with shock and confusion. "I hope you're having an educational day. Sometimes tough love is necessary to help people understand their strengths and limitations." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Dane was finally beginning to understand exactly what his just-a-wife had been capable of all along. "Dolores?" Dane's voice came through the phone with a tremor I had never heard before, the sound of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling in real time. "What did you just say?" I settled back in my leather chair, savoring the moment I had been anticipating since his humiliating performance at dinner the night before. "I said I hope you're having an educational day, darling. Learning can be such a valuable experience, don't you think?" The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could hear the muffled sounds of chaos in the background, phones ringing constantly, urgent conversations, the unmistakable atmosphere of a business in crisis. "Dolores," Dane said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, Do you know something about what's happening to my company today?" "Your company," I replied with gentle curiosity. "Oh, you mean Lynch and Associates Architecture. Yes, I've heard they're experiencing some difficulties. Something about lost contracts and suspended projects. How unfortunate." Another long pause. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Dane's mind as he began to process the impossible implications of my tone. "The Morrison contracts," he said slowly, testing the waters. $47 million in work, canceled simultaneously this morning. And the Wellington project investors, they're restructuring our financing because some foundation withdrew their support. "The Bethany Clive Foundation," I supplied helpfully. "Yes, I understand they've decided to redirect their resources toward emerging architectural practices rather than continuing to support established firms that might not align with their values." "How do you know that?" The question exploded from him with desperate intensity. "How could you possibly know the specific name of the foundation involved?" "I haven't told you any of these details." I allowed myself a small smile that he couldn't see but could probably hear in my voice. "Well, darling, I suppose I must have overheard you discussing it with someone."
You know how wives are, always listening to conversations they don't really understand. Stop. Dane's voice had taken on a commanding tone, the same one he had used the night before when dismissing my questions about his business. Stop playing games and tell me what you know. Games? I replied with mock surprise. Dane, I'm just a wife trying to understand my husband's work. Isn't that what you encouraged me to do? Though I suppose you also said I shouldn't try to comprehend business matters that are beyond my natural capabilities. I heard him slam something, probably his hand against his desk, in frustration. Dolores, listen to me very carefully. My company is facing bankruptcy. $60 million in contracts disappeared in a single day. Every regulatory approval we've been counting on has been delayed or suspended. Our media coverage has been canceled. Our academic partnerships have been terminated. This isn't coincidence. This is systematic destruction. How terrible, I said sympathetically. It sounds like Lynch and Associates might have been depending on artificial support rather than organic business success. What was it you said last night about the dangers of success that isn't really earned? The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me that my arrow had found its target. You, Dane whispered, the word carrying the weight of dawning comprehension. This is you. Somehow this is you. Me. I laughed gently. Dane, you spent last evening explaining to a room full of successful professionals that I don't understand commercial real estate financing, market analysis, or complex business relationships. How could someone with such limited capabilities orchestrate what you're describing? I don't know how, Dane said, his voice gaining strength as anger began to override his shock, but I know it's you. The timing is too perfect. One day after you ask suspicious questions at dinner, my entire business empire collapses. That's not coincidence. Empire, I mused. What an interesting word choice. Though I suppose even empires can fall when they're built on foundations that aren't as solid as they appear. I heard him breathing heavily, clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he believed about his wife's capabilities and his own success. The Bethany Clive Foundation, Dane said suddenly, seizing on the detail that had caught his attention. You knew their name immediately. You knew about the Wellington Project restructuring before I told you. You knew about regulatory delays that haven't been publicly announced. That kind of information doesn't come from casual conversation, that comes from direct involvement. Very good, I said approvingly. You see, you're perfectly capable of analytical thinking when you apply yourself. Though I must say, it's taken you quite a while to start asking the right questions. My God, Dane breathed, the full implications finally hitting him. How long have you been involved in my business? Oh, darling, I replied, my voice carrying the same condescending sweetness he had used with me for years. That's a very complex question involving sophisticated financial structures and strategic relationship management. Are you sure someone with your limited understanding of how the business world really works would be able to comprehend the answer? The sound that came through the phone might have been a sob or a laugh, possibly both.
3 years, Dane said finally, his voice hollow with recognition. 3 years ago, everything started going our way. The contracts started flowing, the regulatory approvals became easier, the media attention increased. It was all you. Just a wife, I confirmed gently, staying in her lane, supporting her husband from the sidelines where she belongs. Though I suppose my lane turned out to be wider than you realized. You've destroyed me, Dane whispered. No, darling, I corrected him. I've simply stopped building you up. Everything that's happening today, this is what Lynch and Associates looks like without artificial support. This is your company operating on its own merits,
exactly as it would have if you had married someone who truly was just a wife. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of his disintegrating business empire. Finally, Dane spoke again, his voice carrying a note of desperate calculation. "What do you want? Money? Public apology? Divorce settlement? Whatever it is, we can negotiate. Just tell me what it will take to fix this." I stood up, moving to my window to watch the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and crimson. "Oh, Dane," I said softly, "you still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation, this is an education." An hour later, Dane stood in the doorway of my home office, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his face carrying the haunted expression of a man who had just discovered that his entire reality was an illusion. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his hair showed the effects of running his hands through it repeatedly during what had clearly been the most devastating day of his professional life. "I need to see it," he said, without preamble, his voice hoarse from hours of frantic phone calls. "Whatever this is, whatever you've built, I need to understand what I'm dealing with." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where Harper had sat just 12 hours earlier as we finalized the systematic destruction of his career. "Please, sit down." For the first time in our 5-year marriage, Dane was seeing my office as it truly was. Gone was the pretense of a charming hobby room, where his wife managed minor charitable activities. The false panels had been removed, revealing the bank of monitors displaying real-time financial data, regulatory filings, and market analysis. The walls were lined with files containing detailed intelligence on every major development project in the metropolitan area. "Jesus Christ," Dane whispered, his eyes scanning the sophisticated equipment that had been hidden in plain sight throughout our marriage. "How long has this been here?" "Since before we met," I replied calmly, settling behind my desk. "Though I've made several upgrades over the years as the operation expanded." Dane slumped into the chair, his earlier anger replaced by something closer to shell shock. "Operation? You call managing my career an operation? I call managing a $50 million investment portfolio an operation," I corrected. "Your career was simply one of many assets under management." I opened the leather portfolio that contained comprehensive documentation of everything I had built while he assumed I was arranging flower displays and planning dinner parties. The financial statements alone were staggering: 18 different shell companies, 7 charitable foundations, and a network of strategic partnerships that touched virtually every aspect of the city's development landscape. "The Bethany Clive Foundation," I continued, sliding the first set of documents across my desk, "is just the most visible entity in a structure that includes Martinez Development Partners, Riverside Investment Group, and Metropolitan Strategic Consulting. Each one designed to support worthy projects while maintaining complete anonymity for the principal investor." Dane picked up the financial statements with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he processed numbers that dwarfed anything he had imagined possible. $50 million. You control $50 million. Closer to $73 million as of this morning's market close, I said matter-of-factly. "Though your company's collapse has actually improved the portfolio's overall performance by eliminating an underperforming asset." The casual brutality of describing his life's work as an underperforming asset seemed to physically wound him. Dane set down the documents and looked at me as if seeing a stranger. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "I thought I married Dolores Hall, a woman who enjoyed art galleries and charity work. But you're talking like some kind of financial mastermind." "I'm Dolores Eleanor Wyatt," I replied, noting how his face went pale at the mention of the Wyatt name. "Granddaughter of Eleanor Wyatt, founder of Wyatt Industrial Holdings. Daughter of Margaret Wyatt, former CEO of Metropolitan Investment Group, an MBA from Harvard Business School, class of 2018. The genealogy hit him like a series of physical blows. The Wyatt name was legendary in business circles. Old money combined with new innovation. A family that had shaped the city's economic landscape for 3 generations. "But you told me you worked in finance," Dane said desperately, grasping for some connection to the reality he thought he had known. "You said you were a secretary or assistant or something." "I said I worked in finance," I agreed. "You assumed I was a secretary. I never corrected your assumption because it seemed easier than explaining that I was actually heir to one of the region's largest investment dynasties." Dane buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been laughter or tears. "So when we met at that gallery opening, when you seemed so impressed by my architectural insights, when you acted like you needed me to explain business concepts to you, I was conducting due diligence," I said simply. "You seemed like an interesting person with genuine talent who might benefit from strategic support." I was right about the talent part, unfortunately wrong about the character assessment. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. 5 years. You've been lying to me for 5 years. I've been protecting you for 5 years, I corrected. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if you had known about my background when we met? You would have either been intimidated into complete submission or become aggressively competitive, trying to prove you were my intellectual equal. Instead, you let me think I was superior to you. I let you reveal who you truly were," I said firmly. "And for 3 years, that person seemed worthy of investment. Your designs showed real innovation. Your commitment to sustainable architecture aligned with the foundation's values, and your personal integrity appeared solid. Until last night. Until last night, when you publicly demonstrated that your respect for me was conditional on maintaining the illusion of your intellectual superiority. The moment you thought you were dealing with someone beneath your capabilities, you became cruel, dismissive, and genuinely ugly in your condescension." Dane was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents that proved his wife had been operating at a level of business sophistication that he could barely comprehend. "So what happens now?" he asked finally. "You've destroyed my company, exposed my dependence on support I never knew existed, and revealed that my marriage was built on a lie. What's your endgame here?" I leaned back in my chair, studying the man I had loved enough to support for 3 years, and who had repaid that support by publicly humiliating me the moment he thought he could do so safely. "Now, Dane," I said quietly, "you get to decide what kind of person you actually want to be. The question is whether you can handle being married to someone who isn't just a wife, someone who might actually be more successful than you are." Dane sat in stunned silence for several minutes, his gaze alternating between the financial documents spread across my desk and the monitors displaying real-time market data that represented more wealth than he had ever imagined being in the same room with, let alone married to. "Lynch and Associates filed for emergency bankruptcy protection an hour ago," he said finally, his voice hollow and mechanical. "Hector called it an unprecedented cascade of market forces beyond our control. He has no idea that those market forces were actually his employee's wife, sitting in her home office, systematically dismantling everything we thought we had built." I nodded, having received Harper's update about the bankruptcy filing 30 minutes earlier. "The firm will likely survive in some reduced capacity," I said, matter-of-factly. "Hector has enough personal relationships to secure smaller residential projects, though you'll never again operate at the scale you've become accustomed to." 23 employees, Dane continued, as if I hadn't spoken. 23 people who trusted that Lynch and Associates was a stable, growing company. They're all getting laid off tomorrow because their boss's wife decided to teach him a lesson about respecting women. The attempt to guilt me was transparent, but I felt compelled to address it directly. Those 23 employees were working for a company that existed only because of artificial support that could be withdrawn at any time. If anything, I've given them the opportunity to find positions with firms that have genuine financial stability. Dane laughed bitterly. Genuine financial stability. Like the kind you've been providing secretly for 3 years while I took credit for building a successful architectural practice. Exactly like that, I agreed. The difference is that those firms earned their success through merit, innovation, and actual business acumen, rather than depending on a spouse they simultaneously dismissed and exploited. He picked up one of the financial statements again, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the scope of what I had been managing while he assumed I was occupied with domestic trivialities. The Morrison family dinners, Dane said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Those weren't social gatherings. You were conducting business meetings in our dining room while I thought you were just being a good hostess. $47 million in contracts negotiated over catered salmon and wine pairings, I confirmed. James Morrison never trusted Lynch and Associates based on your presentations, Dane. He trusted the Foundation's judgment about sustainable architecture practices, and I cultivated that trust through months of carefully orchestrated social interactions. The charity galas where you insisted I network with city planning officials, where I introduced you to the regulatory contacts who expedited your environmental reviews and zoning approvals. Every chance encounter with influential municipal employees was strategically arranged to benefit your projects. Dane set down the documents and looked directly at me, his expression mixing anger with something that might have been admiration. You played me perfectly. For 3 years, you made me believe I was succeeding through my own efforts, while actually controlling every aspect of my professional life. I provided opportunities, I corrected. Your architectural skills are genuine, your design vision has real merit, and your commitment to sustainable building practices, aligned with legitimate market trends. I simply ensured that those talents received the recognition and support they deserved. By manipulating everything behind the scenes while letting me take credit publicly. By loving someone enough to help them succeed even when they were too proud to accept help directly. The word love seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Dane closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of what I was saying was too much to process. And now, he asked. What happens to us now that you've demonstrated exactly how much power you wield and how little I actually understand about my own success? I stood up, moving to the window that overlooked our neighborhood. 2 houses down, I could see the Hendersons hosting a dinner party. The kind of simple social gathering that Dane had always assumed my events were, never recognizing the sophisticated business operations, disguised as casual entertainment. That depends entirely on you, I said without turning around. The question isn't whether you can forgive me for concealing my background and capabilities. The question is whether you can live with a wife who refuses to pretend she's inferior to make you feel superior. You want me to just accept that my wife is some kind of business mastermind who's been running circles around me for our entire marriage. I turned to face him, noting how small he looked in my executive chair, surrounded by evidence of achievements that dwarfed anything he had accomplished independently. I want you to accept that your wife is a person with her own talents, her own ambitions, and her own contributions to make to the world. I want you to recognize that a partnership means acknowledging what each person brings to the relationship, not dismissing half the team as decorative support staff. Dane was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the monitors displaying market data and the woman he was slowly beginning to understand he had never really known. The woman I married, he said finally. The one who seemed impressed by my explanations of basic business concepts, who asked innocent questions about my work, who appeared to need my guidance and protection. That person doesn't exist, does she?
That person, I replied gently, was someone who loved you enough to let you feel important while she worked behind the scenes to make your dreams possible. The question is whether you can love the real person standing in front of you now. Dane looked at me with the expression of someone seeing clearly for the first time, and I wasn't sure whether what he saw would be something he could learn to accept or something that would drive him away forever. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know if I'm strong enough to be married to someone this powerful. Then that, I said quietly, is something you'll need to figure out. The story broke in the financial press exactly 72 hours after Dane's humiliating dinner performance. Harper had carefully orchestrated the timing, ensuring that the narrative would focus on the business implications rather than the personal drama, though the human interest angle proved impossible to contain. Mystery solved. The anonymous benefactor behind city's architecture boom revealed as Wyatt Heiress, read the headline in Metropolitan Business Weekly, accompanied by a photograph of me at my desk, surrounded by the monitors and files that had remained hidden throughout my marriage. The article, written by business journalist Margaret Lynch, yes, another Lynch, though this one was actually talented, painted a picture of strategic philanthropy that had shaped the city's development landscape while remaining completely invisible to the public and even to the primary beneficiaries. For 3 years, the Bethany Clive Foundation and its network of affiliated organizations have been the invisible hand guiding millions of dollars in architectural contracts, regulatory approvals, and development opportunities, Lynch wrote. The revelation that this sophisticated operation was managed by Dolores Wyatt, wife of now bankrupt architect Dane Hall, raises fascinating questions about power, recognition, and the assumptions we make about who really controls business decisions in our city. The irony of the byline wasn't lost on me. Another Lynch writing about the fall of Lynch and Associates, though this one approached the story with the kind of analytical rigor that Hector Lynch's firm had always lacked. By Thursday morning, my phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from business publications, architecture journals, and even mainstream media outlets, fascinated by what they were calling the spouse who secretly controlled her husband's industry. Wyatt, said the reporter from Financial Focus during our scheduled interview, your husband publicly stated that women lacked the analytical capabilities necessary for complex business operations. How does it feel to have your success serve as such a direct contradiction to those beliefs? I considered the question carefully, aware that my response would be quoted extensively and would likely define how this story was remembered. I think the more important question, I replied, is how many other talented individuals, women, minorities, anyone who doesn't fit traditional expectations of what business leaders look like, are quietly driving success that gets attributed to more visible figures. My situation was unusual in its scope, but the underlying dynamic isn't rare at all. The Forbes interview, published the following week, took a different angle: the Wyatt method, how anonymous strategic philanthropy can transform entire industries. What Mrs. Wyatt accomplished, wrote senior editor Anton Clive, the name coincidences in this city never cease to amaze me, represents a masterclass in long-term strategic thinking. Rather than seeking recognition for her contributions, she focused on creating sustainable positive impact through carefully targeted investments and relationship building. The Harvard Business Review reached out for a case study on invisible leadership and the strategic advantages of operating outside traditional power structures. But the article that meant the most to me appeared in Metropolitan Women in Business Quarterly, written by Margaret Hall from Lynch and Associates, the same Margaret who had witnessed Dane's dinner performance and understood immediately what it revealed about his character. The Dolores Wyatt story, Margaret wrote,
isn't just about one woman's remarkable business acumen, it's about the countless women who contribute significantly to their partner's success while being systematically dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. Mrs. Wyatt's revelation forces us to ask how many other just wives are actually the architects of the success we attribute to their husbands. The question resonated far beyond our city's business community, sparking conversations about recognition, partnership, and the invisible work that often drives visible success. Within 2 weeks, I had received speaking invitations from 12 business schools, 7 industry conferences, and 3 international symposiums on strategic philanthropy. The woman who had been dismissed as just a wife had become a symbol of hidden power revealed, though I suspected that wasn't the legacy Dane had intended to create through his dinner table lectures. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to my office, while I was in the middle of a conference call with potential investors interested in funding a new initiative for emerging female architects. The timing felt symbolic. As I was building new structures to support other women's success, the legal framework of my marriage was being formally dissolved. Harper knocked softly and slid the envelope across my desk. During a brief pause in the call, I recognized Dane's attorney's letterhead. Immediately, Whitman, Sterling and Associates, the most expensive divorce firm in the city. Apparently, my husband had decided that if he was going to lose everything, he might as well lose it in style. The terms were surprisingly reasonable. Dane was requesting no alimony, no claim on the Wyatt family assets, and no stake in any of the shell companies or charitable foundations. In exchange, he wanted a clean break with minimal publicity and an agreement that neither party would discuss the marriage publicly, beyond what had already been reported in the business press. Trying to preserve what's left of his dignity, Harper observed when I showed her the documents during our afternoon strategy session. Smart move, considering he has no legal standing to claim any portion of assets that predate the marriage and were always held in your name. I signed the papers that evening, using the same Mont Blanc pen I had used to terminate his company's contracts 2 months earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate. The same instrument that had ended his professional life now officially concluded our personal relationship. But the financial settlement was only part of the story. The real resolution came in watching how Dane handled the aftermath of losing everything he thought he had built. To his credit, he didn't attempt to blame me publicly or claim that his success had been unfairly taken away. The interview he gave to Architecture Today was measured and, surprisingly, reflective. I spent years believing that I was successful because of my own talents and efforts, Dane said in the published piece. Learning that my achievements were largely dependent on support I never recognized or acknowledged was humbling. It forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my assumptions and prejudices. When asked about his marriage, Dane's response showed more insight than I had expected. I married an extraordinary woman and then spent 5 years trying to convince her, and everyone else, that she was ordinary. That says more about my insecurities than her capabilities. The small architectural practice Dane eventually started focused on affordable housing projects and community development, work that generated far less income than his previous luxury residential projects, but seemed to provide him with something closer to genuine satisfaction. He took a teaching position at the community college, working with students who couldn't afford prestigious design schools but showed real passion for creating functional, beautiful spaces. Harper updated me periodically on his progress, not out of lingering attachment but because monitoring former beneficiaries was part of our standard foundation protocols. The report suggested that losing his artificial success had paradoxically freed Dane to discover what he was actually capable of when operating without external support. He's designing a transitional housing complex for single mothers, Harper reported during one of our quarterly reviews. The budget is minimal, but the innovation is remarkable. It's probably the best work he's ever done. I found myself genuinely pleased by this news. The man who had dismissed his wife's capabilities was learning to succeed through merit rather than manipulation, and apparently discovering talents he had never needed to develop when everything came easily. The final legal dissolution was completed on a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 6 months after the dinner that had triggered this entire sequence of events. I left the courthouse feeling neither triumphant nor regretful, just relieved that we had both finally escaped the elaborate fiction that had defined our marriage. That evening, I reviewed the quarterly reports from all 17 foundation programs, noting how the resources previously dedicated to supporting Lynch and Associates had been redirected toward initiatives with greater impact and clearer alignment with our mission. The Dane Hall chapter of my life was officially closed, but the work that had always been my true passion continued to grow and evolve. 2 years later, I stood before an audience of 300 business leaders at the annual Metropolitan Economic Development Conference, delivering the keynote address on hidden architectures of success, recognizing invisible contributions in professional partnerships. The auditorium was filled with CEOs, venture capitalists, and industry pioneers who had come to hear from the woman whose story had fundamentally changed conversations about recognition, partnership, and the assumptions we make about who really drives business success. The question isn't whether there are other dollars Wyatts operating invisibly in our business community, I said, looking out at the sea of faces that included many women whose own contributions had likely been overlooked or undervalued. The question is whether we're ready to recognize and celebrate their work before it takes a dramatic revelation to make their efforts visible. In the front row, I spotted Anton Wyatt from the original Lynch and Associates team. No longer unemployed, he had become a successful independent consultant specializing in sustainable development projects. He nodded approvingly, one of the few people who had witnessed both my husband's condescension and the systematic dismantling that followed. My case was unusual only in its scale and the dramatic nature of its revelation, I continued. But the underlying pattern, talented individuals whose contributions are dismissed, overlooked, or attributed to more visible partners, exists throughout our professional landscape. The Bethany Clive Foundation had grown exponentially since my story became public. What had once been a carefully guarded secret operation now managed over $200 million in strategic investments, with a particular focus on supporting women-owned businesses, minority-led firms, and innovative approaches to community development. We've established the Invisible Impact Initiative, I announced, which will provide anonymous support to promising individuals whose talents are being underutilized due to systemic biases or personal circumstances. The goal isn't to create dependency, but to level playing fields that have been artificially tilted by prejudice and assumption. The initiative represented everything I had learned from the Dane experience: the importance of supporting merit while requiring accountability, the value of strategic anonymity, and the necessity of eventually revealing support systems so that success stories could inspire others. After the presentation, during the networking reception, Margaret Hall approached me with a warm smile. She had left the ruins of Lynch and Associates to start her own firm, which now employed 15 people and specialized in public housing projects that won both architectural awards and community praise. "You know," Margaret said, raising her wine glass in a quiet toast, "I've been thinking about that dinner 2 years ago. Dane's performance was certainly educational, but not in the way he intended." "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "He taught everyone at that table exactly what happens when you systematically underestimate the people closest to you. It's become a cautionary tale I share with young architects who think success means never acknowledging their dependencies or partnerships." I smiled, remembering my husband's confident declaration that he was providing educational value through his condescending lecture about women's limitations. The irony, I reflected, is that he was absolutely right about education being valuable. He just didn't realize he was going to be the student rather than the teacher. As the evening concluded, I received a text message from Harper. Dane's affordable housing project won the State Architecture Award for Community Impact. Thought you'd want to know. I did want to know. Not because I felt any lingering attachment to my former husband, but because it confirmed something important about the nature of authentic success versus artificial achievement. The man who had built his reputation on secretly supported luxury projects was now earning recognition for work that reflected his genuine capabilities and values. The woman who had been dismissed as just a wife had become a symbol of hidden power revealed and redirected toward meaningful impact. Standing on the conference center's terrace, looking out over the city where so many of my anonymous investments continued to create jobs, housing, and opportunities for people who might otherwise be overlooked, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. Dane's cruel words that night had forced me to stop hiding, stop diminishing myself, stop accepting the role of invisible supporter while others claimed credit for my work. In trying to put me in my place, he had inadvertently freed me to claim my rightful position as a leader and innovator in my own right. Sometimes the most important education comes from teachers who don't realize what they're actually instructing. And sometimes being called just a wife is exactly the motivation needed to show the world what extraordinary things ordinary-seeming people can accomplish when they finally decide to stop hiding their light. The story that began with public humiliation had become a legacy of empowerment, recognition, and the dangerous beauty of underestimating someone whose true capabilities remain hidden until the moment they choose to reveal them. After all, the most powerful people are often those you never see coming.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.